Hey, this is week 8. Welcome. How are you? Just want to check in real quick. Um, Sorry about not being able to do one of these last week. The week completely got away and I got sick, which you can still kind of hear. So, all told, sorry about that. So, this is me trying to catch up a little bit. Just some housekeeping. We have the interview paper due March 2nd at 11:59, so don't forget about that. If you have any questions or if you need anything last minute while you're writing it, let me know. I will help as best I can. Enjoy spring break next week. It's already coming. We're moving right along. And also just a reminder, as things start to pick up and things start to become due, if I don't hear from you, that means everything is great in my mind. That means there are no problems. So if there are problems, if you need help, if there are things that are confusing, let me know. Take the initiative, reach out. A number of people already have, which is great. But just continue to do that, and I will continue to be as helpful as I possibly can be. So anyway, we're still in Dreyer. We're going to spend a lot of time in Dreyer because it's a big, thick book. How do you like it so far? Do you like it? It's a little different, right? It's something that was definitely out of the box. I knew I wanted something that talked about theology, but this was a little bit of a weird way to get into it. I like it though because it lets us get into some heavy theology in an accessible way. Um, we are studying this guy's life, and this guy's life is giving us access into some pretty heavy theology, letting us talk about Catholic theology, because Dante coming out of the Catholic tradition, Dreyer not a Catholic, an ex-Catholic. Um, so it gives us a lot of perspectives. It gives us a lot of takes, which I like. So hopefully it's working for you in terms of a book. I figured it was better than a straight theological scholarly. Because nothing against those books, I love those books, but this might be a little bit more accessible, a little bit more fun to read. So anyway, as we left off, Dante is proceeding through the Inferno, and Dreyer is kind of following this journey from afar, if you will. But Dante proceeds through the Inferno. Virgil is the guide, and he is seeing the punishments for various sins on earth. So the punishments are not random. They're not pernicious in the sense that they're just randomly chosen to hurt people. They're chosen as a direct reflection of the life of the individual on earth. So in chapter 9, you have knowledge as idol. You have the people that are setting knowledge above faith, knowledge above love of God. Um, and that really hits home for Dreyer, because Dreyer is someone who is a book nerd, whose first move is to cognitively understand. But again, this is a good thing, and for all of us at UF, it's like, yay, we're glad this is a good thing. This is why we're here. But what makes it not so good, remember, is the disordering of it. Dreyer wants to follow Dante, wants to follow Augustine, saying sin is disordered love. It is love out of order, love out of balance. So that's how good things turn bad. And in this case, the good thing is knowledge, book learning. There's a little quote, I don't know who said it, but kind of captures the idea. You can have all the right answers, but still be mean. So if your theology is on point, you know everything there is to know, and you're still just a really mean, unpleasant, cruel individual, then you haven't figured it out. It goes deeper than cognitive learning. It's more than a set of cognitive beliefs, and Dreyer needs to learn that, and it's really, really hard for him to learn that. But the way in which he learns it, and this is where we get introduced to Father Matthew, who's another one of his Virgils. He's going to talk about the Virgils that Dreyer has in his own life. Father Matthew's one of them, the Orthodox priest who kind of serves as a spiritual mentor for him. The way in which he prescribes a cure is through ritual. He gives them the prayer beads. He gives them the what would seemingly be a monotonous task of reciting prayers 100 times a day. He gives him this idea of ritual, and specifically asceticism. Ritual that's not necessarily fun. Ritual that takes effort, as a way to change, as a way to pave the ground in Dreyer's heart for change. The way that Father Matthew put it was the only way to help people was to heal my own heart. So he offers ritual as a way, not a way to be saved, and this is something that's often, you talk about major talking points of Christianity. There's differences of opinion here. There's not that many traditions. There's a fine line. Let me put it this way. One of the common critiques of fundamentalism and evangelicalism towards Catholicism, and towards even towards more progressive expressions of religion, mainline religion, is that they're trying to earn their salvation. They're trying to get themselves to a place where they're good enough that God says, all right, you're good enough, you're in, you didn't quite make it, you're out. That's kind of a simplistic reading a lot of times, because what happens in these other traditions, like the Orthodox traditions, the Catholic tradition, and even the traditions that are using asceticism. You can talk about the new monastics. You can talk about all of these different groups. They're not necessarily using asceticism. They're not using practices like fasting and prayer beads and things like that. They're not doing it to show themselves worthy of salvation. They're doing it as a way to clear the junk out of their own hearts, if you will, so that God can act. Um, that's typically how the doctrine goes. Now, obviously, this can be misread and twisted and misinterpreted. But the standard telling is that no, we're not earning our salvation, but what we are doing is we are preparing ourselves for God to act in a salvific way within us. Do you see the difference? So it's not earning salvation, but it is tilling the ground, if you will, preparing for the movement. Not preparing for your own effort, but preparing the ground so someone else can come in and do what needs to be done. That's a little bit closer to the mark in terms of how these doctrines are often construed. Obviously, in real life, it changes, but it's an important distinction, and it's one that Father Matthew hits in the course of this book. So anyway, he progresses further into the Inferno, watches the disfiguring nature of sin. It turns out when you disorder your loves, when your love is out of balance, it gets really disfiguring and nasty if it gets carried through all the way to its end. You have people who are created. Christianity teaches that people are created in the image of God. There's something of the God spark within them, if you want to put it that way. But the disfiguring effects of sin as disordered love take that and warp it into something truly evil and ugly and disgusting. The Italian term that is used here is contrapasso. It means literally to suffer the opposite. So you are basically taking this disorder to its logical conclusion, and you're seeing the punishments for it in the Inferno. So again, the punishments are not meaningless or random. For example, if you were a flatterer, if you were too cowardly to speak truth to people who needed to hear it, and you were basically just telling people what they wanted to hear in order to get ahead, your punishment in the Inferno was to literally have your face full of poo. You were spewing poo while you were alive, now you have it all up in your face when you're dead. It's a direct result of how you lived and how you let sin disfigure you, if that makes sense. So Dante is at pains to show that sin is not just abstract or intellectual, it's real, and it has real consequences. It disfigures. So this is how good things turn bad, and this is how bad things turn destructive. The disorder creates dysfunction, creates disfigurement. And that's kind of, in Dante's telling, that's kind of how sin works. And again, he's not making that up. He's following Augustine, following a long train of thought. But that's how the process works itself out, as Dante is telling it. So we go further into the Inferno. And these chapters, through this section, chapters 10, 11, 12, so on and so forth, are really just taking us deeper into the Inferno. You get heresy and idolatry. Chapter 11, you get Dreyer's own story, where you get these good things like family and place that are good, objectively good. They're turned into idols because the love for those things is more than love for God, more than love for other things. That the love goes out of balance, and what happens is these things become idols. They become. It's funny because when you think idol, maybe you think like stone statues. Raiders of the Lost Ark, the opening sequence where Indiana Jones swipes the idol and outruns the big ball. But anything can be an idol. John Calvin, the Protestant theologian, said the human heart is an idol factory. Christianity teaches that human beings are exceptionally good at turning anything into gods, small g gods, including things that were already good, especially things that were good already. So this is how family and place become God, become sin, become idolatry. They're loved too much, and they become the ends rather than the means, and you make them do something it was never meant to do. And if you've ever been, in your own life, if you've ever been in a romantic relationship that turned toxic, a lot of times this is what happens. You look for this other person to be your everything, and when it turns out they can't be that, the whole thing gets sideways and gets sour. It's kind of a smaller representation of what's going on here. So yeah, and idols are tyrants, and they will they will run your life, and not in a good way. And Dreher's finding that out the hard way. And he's working through all this family stuff, all this father stuff. He's working through all this while reading Dante, and Dante's giving him some insights into why things are the way that they are. So it's becoming a valuable experience for him, and it's a way in which theology, Christian understanding of sin, is informing his modern scenario, his modern situation, and playing itself out. And it's helping him out a lot. So anyway, deeper into the Inferno, the worst sins are the ones, we get into worse sins as we get further into the Inferno. The worst sins are the ones which corrupt the image of God in you the most. So that leads us into suicide, and it's horribly controversial to think about suicide as sin. Dante certainly does, but here's his reasoning. He says, look, if you were created in the image of God, sin disfigures. Disorderment leads to disorder leads to disfigurement. Then suicide is the ultimate expression of disfiguring the image of God in you as you were created. And Dreher wants to say yes, and I'll go even a step further. It is a weird sense of self-love which propels suicide. People, in his telling, suicide is for people who cannot give up the obsession of living life on their terms. They make themselves into God. I will ultimately have control of my life in a perverse way. The way in which I would do it is to end it. Now, you can agree with that. You can disagree with that. It's a horribly controversial take, but that's where Dreher's coming from. That's where Dante's coming from, and they're giving you reasons as to why. And it comes from. Don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that all Christians believe this way, but it is coming from a foundation of Christian belief of Dante and the Catholicism that he was based on. And then it gets even more controversial in chapter 13. He wants to talk about homosexuality as violence against nature. Dante is a Catholic, and as such, he's relying on natural law. And if you don't know what natural law is, it comes from someone named Thomas Aquinas, who was a doctor of the church, major theologian of the church, probably one of the foremost, in the Catholic world in particular, probably the foremost theologian not named St. Paul who's ever lived. So Aquinas says, all right, here's what's going on. There is the eternal law, which is the mind of God. There is the divine law, which is that part of the eternal law given through divine revelation. So the eternal law is beyond human capacity, really. The divine law is what God takes from the eternal law and says, here, I'm giving this to you. This is my revelation to you, primarily through the scriptures, but also through other things as well. But most, the divine revelation is most through the scriptures. And then there's this thing called natural law, which is that part of the eternal law figured out by reason, by our ability to figure stuff out. So you have revelation and you have reason working in tandem together. They create human law, and the goal of human law is to be as close to eternal law as possible. So basically the eternal law, in the eternal law, things are created to be a certain way. If you're talking, there's a farmer named Joel Salvin who has an interesting expression. He says we must honor the pigness of the pig. What does that mean? That means that pigs were created to function and act in a certain way. And factory farming, confined animal feeding operations, don't do that. Whereas his mode of and method of farming does. Human beings the same way. In accordance with natural law teaching, human beings are created to function a certain way. They have a nature that they are expected to follow. They have an end, a telos, an end that they are working towards, if you will, a development process that they are working through, and a goal in mind at the end. And in Dante's telling, homosexuality is violence against that nature, that telos, that the way in which we've been created according to the eternal law. So again, obviously, horribly controversial. Obviously, not all Christians believe this at all. I would say probably less Christians believe this now than maybe ever before, just because of where we are in society. And and there are people who celebrate that, and there are people who lament that, and all points in between. But this is where Dante's coming from. Dreher wants to skirt the issue a little. He doesn't want to get into the details of that, but he does want to talk about this idea of, if you were created to be a certain way, and you go off in a different way, you are serving yourself and you're not serving the purposes for which you were made, and those purposes in the Christian tradition are serving others. Now the connection here is he wants to talk about, because in the natural law, part of what we are expected to do, part of what we were created to do, is create more of us. And if you go in a different direction, you are denying that function, if you will. So Dreyer wants to skirt the issue of homosexuality. I don't want to talk about that directly, but he does want to talk about this idea of if you depart from the path that you were supposed to be on, it's ultimately a selfish move. You're serving yourself instead of other people, and you will be held accountable for that. So he wants to make it into a more general thing. Which leads into chapter 14, evil in the church. So again, people who were created and given the task of doing a certain thing go way off from where they're supposed to be. Dante encounters Nicholas III, who is bound for hell, because in perverting good and evil, his sin was profound. Basically, if you're a leader of the church, you're held to a higher standard, you're expected to be more. And the fact that he not only was not more exemplary than his parishioners, but was in fact less moral, meant that his sin was profound, his perversion was profound, and he was bound for hell. And this is a tale that plays itself out over and over and over and over in the history of the Christian church. There's a quote here that's attributed to Augustine that says, "The church is a whore, but she is my mother." This is a tension that works itself out in most religions, but Christianity has definitely had to wrestle with it. The fact that Christianity teaches a good and sinless God through the vessel of a horribly broken and sinful church. How does that work? It's a paradox, it's a conundrum, it's a difficulty. But if the church is given as the body of Christ, which is traditional Christian teaching, but that body is racked with sin, then how can they adequately represent a sinless God? It's a tough question. It's not an easy question. And Dante's dealing with it here. Augustine was dealing with his quotation. And I think I gave you 2 discussion questions on this topic in a row for that reason, really wrestling with that contradiction. If the God figure in Christianity is seen as sinless and perfect, but then the God figure turns to humanity and says, "Go carry my message forward," and humanity being the frail, fragile creatures that we are, how does that work? And sometimes, as you can see, sometimes it doesn't work very well at all. But at the same time, there is, the apologists for the church would say, yeah, that's true, but, after all the dictators of history who wanted to stamp out the church, after all the criticism, after everything else, we're still here. So there's lots of different conversations that can be had, but the center of it, at least in this case, is this idea of sinful people carrying out the will and the desires of a sinless God. So you have, again, chapters 15 and 16, hammer on this issue of how fragile human beings really are. Focuses on Ulysses, the pride and vanity of Ulysses, and the realization that Dreyer comes to through this process of reading is in chapter 16. He says the journey through hell is about examining your own faults. So the whole first part of the thing is, yes, we are broken, and we have created a broken world as a result. And we can't make it right on our own. We need God to fix it for us. And that leads us to the doorstep of purgatory, which is where we're going to head next. So you have the moral of the story when it comes to the Inferno is about fragility. It's about sin and the effects of sin, and how sin is not something that you can look at least in Christian teaching. Sin is not something that you can just kind of point to out there. But rather it's something that begins here and spreads out there. I don't know if I told this story already, forgive me if I did, but G.K. Chesterton was a famous 20th century Christian apologist, a public intellectual, and the London Times newspaper sent out a request to Chesterton and a whole bunch of other intellectuals to answer the question in an essay, what is wrong with the world? So they get these essays back from theologians, or from philosophers and thinkers, and they're just pages and pages and pages. Chesterton sends back a response. He says, "Dear sirs, I am. Sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton." His point is, what is wrong with the world? Where does it come from? It comes from the heart of every individual, Christian and non-Christian alike. And the whole, one of the main ideas of the Christian teaching is that the supernatural action has to happen in order to take these wrongs and make them right. we are on a trajectory towards death and disfigurement and destruction unless we are set right by an eternal external force. So we'll start to talk about that next week. So until then, obviously, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, yeah, keep going, and please holler if you have questions.